E l'argomento
detachment from all creation or decentralized from one's own self in order to encounter God's mercy and human misery. Brother Domenico Carena published in the circular letter of the Cottolengo brothers of September 1988 a study entitled Detachment from Creation in the Thought of Canon Cottolengo, analyzing the manuscripts that our founder submitted to the sisters and brothers at the moment of their religious profession or of the renewal of their vows. Brother Domenico identifies detachment from creation as the first characteristic of Cottolengo spirituality, which constitutes an essential basis of the attitude of faith, of trust in divine providence, and of the charitable service, to be lived in the perspective of the kingdom. Brother Domenico, with a slight tone of controversy, writes that this hypothesis emerges from the saints' writings, and by preceding them with brief comments in order to place them in their historical context and facilitate their understanding, he leaves to the specialist the task of deducing the consequences and drawing conclusions. However, he says, there is no need of an exceptional mind to understand that when the life of a person or a structure relies on the security of worldly goods, they cannot bear witness in a convincing and stable manner to God the Provident Father. Similarly, only those who are radically detached from created things, beginning with themselves and their families, can be totally available to seeing the glory of the Creator, putting their natural talents and gifts of grace in full-time service to the poor. In the thought, and probably in the personal experience of the saint, continues Brother Domenico, the greater or lesser detachment from all created things, especially from relatives, reveals the diaphragm of in an inversely proportional level of one's fidelity to God and to one's vocation. In other words, the saints suggest that only those who are free from worldly bonds can be completely available for their mission. This argument is hard to accept, and someone may have considered watering it down, thinking of it as a consequence of the great crisis suffered by Canon Cottolengo, or even as an effect of some residual form of Jansenism. This may be true. Nevertheless, this idea, attested by the testimony of the life of our saints and of our first brothers and sisters, represent the foundation of the nascent little house, and therefore remains a point of reference for all spiritual sons and daughters of Cottolengo in every time and every place. Without this solid pillar, the physiognomy of the Cottolengo community gets altered. Conversations may be mystified, and it is of little use to look for more or less exotic devotional surrogates. The evangelical paradox, go and sell your possessions and give to the poor, and come follow me, finds in Cottolengo one of the most radical actualizations in the history of the Church. The forms can and must change accordingly to the times, and places, but the substance remains the same, and above all, we should always find the courage to confront ourselves with the ideal that Cottolengo was proposing. Almost half a century ago, Brother Domenico wrote, The contemporary Cottolengo family, willingly or unwillingly, is at an historical crossroad and is drawn into the dilemma whether to submit itself to the inexorable increase of social services, to the power of more and more advanced technology, and to further accumulation of structures and material goods, or to try to follow a more evangelical and a less triumphant path that would lead to conscience and spiritual responsibility, which at the end could bring a new meaning to everyone's life and repropose Cottolengo experience as a model for the Church. I believe that this analysis of Brother Carena lacks an element that in those years was just beginning to appear. I'm referring to the numerical decline in vocations. As Brother Domenico says, willingly or unwillingly, the reduced number of religious vocations compel us not only to find new ways of detachment from material goods, but also to search for new forms of cooperation that perhaps may overshadow individual characteristics, but will allow the development of the charism in favor of the poor and make it sustainable at the same time. At the time of the saint, his work was in some way conditioned by the economical sustainability, while there were many human resources attracted by the charism that he embodied. Paradoxically, today, the situation has been completely reversed. Beyond a prudent use of the goods that the Provvidenza continue to offer and their careful and intelligent administration, the great challenge we have to face comes from the human resources that are necessary to live our charism. Today, we do not lack the means to carry on the charitable work, but we lack people to put the charism into practice. We need enthusiastic, convinced and convincing people, as Cottolengo wished, who may touch the hearts of every creature, igniting that spark of healthy restlessness that the Lord has put in it. This may shake one's convictions and unreflected upon beliefs, which can often be at the basis of a choice of life, whether a religious one or of social commitment. These reflections lead us to the second part of the topic entrusted to me, the detachment from oneself in order to recognize God's mercy and our poverty or misery. In the space of one generation or so, we have witnessed an enormous change in the little house and in the Cottolengo environment. I have lived in Ecuador for 26 years, and on my return, I had had time to adapt myself to a reality that was substantially different from the one I had left. Therefore, I understand the difficulty of those who are unable to adapt themselves when they return and enter into a crisis. When we leave, it is true that we are sent, but it is also true that we accept a challenge that in some way stimulates our ambition and makes us willing to endure many difficulties. On the other hand, when we return, it is often for health reasons or because of reorganization of services. And we arrive here, we find that the key points of reference we had left behind are no longer there. The only thing that remains is the charity and the poor. But everything that was revolving around this center has changed. I bet that if we judge only on the basis of personal criteria and of our own ambition, we would say that it has not changed for the better. These considerations bring us back to what we said at the beginning about the need for detachment from creation as the saint urged his daughters and sons. I am almost sure not to be wrong saying that it is easier to detach ourselves from material goods than from our aspirations, projects, ideas, and everything that concerns our ego and the personal fulfillment. At the root of our acting and doing, there is always an ideal to believe in, but it should be clear that every personal effort must always have a centrifugal thrust that moves us away from our ego and pushes us towards our neighbor. If this is not the case, the risk of failure is certain. And when our ideal becomes a necessary profession that makes us feel good and fulfilled, even if it was the highest ideal, it will lose transparency and credibility. I would like to conclude this reflection with a thought from Cardinal Balestrero, a thought that I cannot quote because it was transcribed during my first years of religious life. But I remember that it was a course of spiritual exercises that had Our Lady as its theme. And at the end of a meditation, you would leave the listeners a question to reflect upon. Are there in our lives those gestures of discreet charity that never highlight our person and always arrive just a little before the needs arise and things happen, so that suffering is avoided and some consolation is given? So, an intuitive, outgoing charity, Pope Francis would say, is capable of anticipating the needs and the necessities of others, to spare them pain and distribute joy, but at the same time, never highlighting oneself. It is a lifestyle lived by Cottolengo, who referred to himself as a poor cobbler of Provvidenza, and was well embodied by those Cottolengo spiritual sons and daughters who preceded us on the path of holiness: Father Paleari, Brother Luigi, and Sister Maria Carola. This challenge is still present and will accompany us through our lives, but in the end, there will be neither winners nor losers, only the glory of God, the Provident Father. Amen.
Gloria di Dio, Padre Provvidente. Così sia.